Hi guys, tonight we follow the edge of a mountain range as the light starts to change on the ridgeline above you. You are standing where the ground first begins to rise, at the place where flat land ends and the slope begins, and you notice it before you understand it. The air feels different here. It moves differently. Something about the way it slides down off the high rock and settles around your ankles tells you the ground ahead is not like the ground behind. You look up. The peaks are still far off, gray and blue in the distance, catching a thin line of gold along their upper edges. Lower down, the slopes are dark with trees, and lower still, the trees give way to the long grass where you are standing now. There is a kind of pull to it, the way the land keeps climbing, fold after fold, until it disappears into cloud. Wherever you are as you listen, if you enjoy this kind of calm storytelling, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And if you genuinely like it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see where these quiet moments are being shared. You shift your weight and feel the ground answer differently than it does on flat earth. Even here, at the base, the soil is looser, mixed with small stones that roll under your feet if you're not careful. Somewhere above, a rockfall clatters faintly, small stones finding their way down a slope you can't see. You pause and listen until the sound fades. Then you keep walking. The mountain does not ask permission. It simply is there, and everything you do from now on will be shaped by it, where you can walk, where you can rest, which way the wind will come from, how long the light will last before the peaks swallow the sun early and leave the lower ground in shadow while the sky above is still bright. Early humans moving into mountain country would have learned this quickly, the way the land itself begins making decisions for you. You walk along the edge where forest meets open slope, keeping to the places where the ground is even. The trees here are shorter than the ones in the lowlands, bent slightly from wind that comes down off the peaks even on calm days. Their branches grow thicker on one side, the side away from the wind, and you notice this without really thinking about it, the way the whole forest seems to lean gently in one direction, like it has been listening to the mountain for a long time and has learned to answer. A stream cuts through the grass ahead, running fast and clear, fed by snow higher up even though the air down here is warm enough. You crouch and touch the water. It's cold enough to sting a little. You follow its edge upstream because water usually knows the way through difficult ground, cutting the easiest path between stone and slope over years and years until the path becomes obvious to anyone who bothers to look. The climb starts gently. You barely notice it at first, just a slight lean forward in your steps, a slight pull in your legs that wasn't there a few minutes ago. The grass gives way to low shrubs, then to bare rock scattered with patches of moss. You place your feet carefully now, testing each stone before trusting it with your full weight. Some stones look solid and aren't. You learn this the way everyone learns it, by feeling one shift slightly under your foot and adjusting before it becomes a problem. Above you, a bird moves along the rock face, riding some current of air you can't feel from here. It doesn't flap much, it just tilts and slides. using the mountain's own wind the way you're learning to use the mountain's paths. You watch it for a while before it disappears around an outcrop of stone. The light is different this high, even this early into the climb. It comes at a lower angle, catching the pale rock and making it glow slightly, while the trees below are already sliding into shadow. You notice how quickly the mountain changes the rules of daylight. Down in the valley, the sun would still be well above the tree line. Up here, the ridge to your left is already cutting a line of shade across the slope, and you know that shade will keep growing as the sun moves, swallowing the ground beneath it hour by hour. You find a flatter shelf of rock and stop to rest, not because you're tired exactly, but because the mountain rewards pausing. From here you can see the shape of the land ahead, a shoulder of stone rising to your right, a shallow gully cutting down to your left, and beyond both, a saddle where the ridge dips low enough that a person might cross without climbing all the way to the peak. That's where you'll head. Not up. Around, a soft wind moves past, carrying a mineral smell, something like wet stone and old snow, even though no snow is visible from here. It's a smell you'll come to know well over the coming days, faint and cold and slightly sharp, always arriving before whatever it's warning you about. It's coming from somewhere higher up, somewhere you can't see yet. You notice the temperature drops slightly with it, just a degree or two, enough to make the hair on your arms rise. Then it passes and the air warms again, and you're left with the small, useful knowledge that the wind up here doesn't behave the way it does down below. It arrives in waves, carrying pieces of weather from places still out of sight. You gather a few pieces of dry wood as you go, snapping branches from the low shrubs, because even a short climb in mountain country means thinking ahead about fire. The wood here is different from lowland wood, drier, more brittle, twisted from growing in wind. It will burn fast and hot if you get a flame going, but it won't last as long, so you gather more than you think you'll need. The gully to your left holds a thin trickle of water, barely a stream, more like the memory of one, running down from somewhere above where snow is slowly giving itself up to the season. You step across it easily. In a different month, you understand without needing to be told, this same gully might be a roaring channel, carrying meltwater fast enough to knock a person off their feet. Right now, it's calm. That could change, and you keep this in the back of your mind the way you keep most things in mountain country, not worried, just aware. Ahead, the saddle you noticed earlier is closer now, a low dip between two higher shoulders of rock. The wind is stronger there, funneled through the gap, and you can see grass bending flat in a way it isn't bending anywhere else on the slope. You'll feel that wind directly in a few minutes. For now, you keep climbing toward it, one careful step at a time, letting the rhythm of the climb settle into something steady, something your legs can hold without complaint. Research suggests early mountain-dwelling humans developed a strong sense of route memory, learning to recognize saddles, gullies, and shelves of stone as reliable paths through otherwise difficult terrain. You feel a version of that now, a kind of instinct for where the ground will be kind and where it won't, even on a slope you've never climbed before. It isn't knowledge exactly, it's closer to listening. The wind hits you properly as you reach the saddle, cold and steady, pushing against your chest hard enough that you lean into it slightly to keep your balance. From here, the view opens in both directions the valley you came from behind you, small and green and already dimming toward evening, and ahead, a wider basin ringed by higher peaks, patches of old snow clinging to the shadowed sides where the sun never quite reaches. The air smells sharper here, thinner, somehow, though you couldn't say exactly why. You don't linger at the saddle. The wind discourages it, cutting through easily, finding every gap in what little protection your position offers. You move on, dropping slightly into the basin ahead, where the ground curves inward and the wind at least softens. The change is immediate and welcome. Within a few steps, the cold pressure on your chest eases, and you can hear your own breathing again instead of just the wind. The basin holds a scattering of large stones, some taller than you, weathered into strange rounded shapes by wind and ice working on them for longer than you could guess. Between them, patches of tough grass and small flowering plants cling to whatever soil has gathered in the cracks. It's a hard place to live, and yet things live here anyway, quietly, close to the ground, out of the worst of the wind. You choose a spot near one of the larger stones where its bulk breaks the wind from one direction at least and begin arranging the wood you gathered earlier. The light is beginning to lean toward evening now, the sun dropping toward the western ridge, and though there are still hours of daylight left down in the valley, up here the shadow will come early. Mountains keep their own clock, and you've learned enough today to know better than to argue with it. Getting the fire going takes patience. The wind keeps finding its way around the stone, threatening the small flame before it can catch properly. You cup your hands, shield it with your body, feed it slowly, small pieces at first until it holds. Once it does, it burns fast, exactly as you expected from wood this dry, and you feed it steadily to keep it from burning through everything at once. Sitting near the fire, you feel the day's climb settle into your legs, a dull ache that isn't unpleasant so much as informative. It tells you how far you've come, how much ground the mountain made you earn. Above the basin, the peaks are catching the last direct light, turning a shade of orange-pink that the lower slopes never see, already deep in blue shadow themselves. A sound reaches you from somewhere up the slope, not close, not threatening, just present. Something moving across loose stone, unhurried. You don't turn to look right away. You just listen, letting the sound tell you what it can. It fades after a moment, whatever it was continuing on its own path, indifferent to yours. The mountain is full of these small sounds, evidence of other lives moving through the same difficult ground, mostly unseen, mostly uninterested in you. The fire settles into steady coals as the light continues to fade. You add a little more wood, not much, just enough to keep a small flame going through what's left of the evening. The cold is arriving properly now, the kind that comes with altitude rather than season, settling into the basin as the sun's warmth pulls away from the stone around you. You pull your knees up slightly, closer to the fire, and watch the last color drain from the peaks above. The wind that was so sharp at the saddle has quieted here in the basin, reduced to an occasional soft push against your back, more like a reminder than a threat. Somewhere close by, water drips steadily, a thin trickle finding its way between stones, the sound almost rhythmic in the growing quiet. The stars are starting to show themselves, and they seem closer here than they do in the lowlands, sharper somehow, as though the thinner air lets more of their light through. You notice a few before you notice you're noticing them, scattered points appearing gradually as the last blue drains from the sky. For now, though, the basin holds you well enough. The stone at your back has given up the last of the day's warmth and gone cool, but the fire still holds, and the wind stays mostly elsewhere, and the ground beneath you, hard as it is, feels steady in a way that matters more than comfort does, up here, on the first evening among the mountains. The morning arrives differently in mountain country than it does anywhere else you've known. The light doesn't rise gradually from the horizon the way it does over flat land. Instead, it appears first on the highest peaks, catching their edges in pale gold while the basin around you stays in shadow, cold and still, for what feels like a long time before the sun finally clears the eastern ridge and reaches you directly. You wake to that light on the peaks before you feel any warmth from it yourself, and for a while you watch the color creep slowly down the slopes above, the way it slides over one shoulder of rock after another, revealing details that were invisible in last night's dark ledges, gullies, thin lines that might be old paths worn by animals moving the same routes for generations. The fire has gone to ash overnight, just a few faint coals still holding warmth beneath the gray surface. You don't rebuild it yet. The morning cold is sharp but not dangerous, and moving will warm you faster than sitting still ever could. You gather what little you carried, check the sky in each direction out of habit more than concern, and start toward the far side of the basin, where a narrow gap between two peaks suggests a way forward. The ground here is different from yesterday's flatter for a while, scattered with loose scree that shifts slightly under each step, forcing you to adjust your balance constantly. You lean into a rhythm, feet finding solid stone before committing weight, the same careful pattern you learned on the earlier slope, now becoming something closer to instinct than conscious choice. A herd of animals moves along the far side of the basin, small dark shapes against the pale stone, picking their way across ground that looks impossible from this distance. You watch them for a while. They move with a confidence you don't have yet on this terrain, choosing routes that seem to appear from nowhere, crossing places where the slope looks too steep to hold a footing. Early humans in mountain regions likely learned some of their best routes by following animal trails, trusting that a creature which lived here permanently would know the ground better than any visitor could. You notice, too, the way the herd's movement shifts subtly as you watch a slight bunching together, heads lifting more often, a pause that spreads through the group without any single animal seeming to lead it. Nothing in the sky suggests a reason for the change. No cloud, no obvious threat. But you take note anyway, the way you've learned to take note of small, unexplained shifts in how the mountain's creatures behave, since they often notice things worth noticing well before you do. After a few minutes, the herd settles again, resuming its slow grazing path, and whatever passed between them, unseen and unheard by you, seems to have passed entirely. The gap between the peaks grows closer, and with it, the wind returns, funneled the same way it was at yesterday's saddle, gathering speed as it's forced through the narrow space. You feel it before you're fully inside the gap, a cold pressure building against your chest, pushing your hair back, carrying with it a faint smell of ice even though you can't see any from where you stand. Passing through the gap itself takes concentration. The path narrows to barely more than a shoulder's width in places, stone rising sheer on both sides, and the wind seems to want to push you toward the edge rather than through the middle. You keep one hand near the rock wall, not quite touching it, ready to steady yourself if a stronger gust catches you off balance. It doesn't. The wind stays steady, strong but predictable, and you move through it the way you'd move through fast water, not fighting it, just accounting for it. On the far side, the land opens into something wider and stranger than the basin behind you. A long ridge stretches away to your right, bare and exposed, catching full sun now that the morning has properly arrived. To your left, the ground drops steeply into a valley thick with dark forest, a river visible far below as a thin silver thread. Straight ahead, the path continues along a shelf of rock, narrow but level, hugging the mountainside as it curves out of sight. You choose the shelf. It offers the most protection from the wind and the clearest footing, even if it means walking closer to the drop on your left than feels entirely comfortable. You keep your eyes on the ground just ahead of your feet, checking each placement, occasionally glancing up to confirm the path continues the way you expect. The valley below doesn't interest you much right now. What matters is the stone directly beneath you. The shelf holds steady for a long stretch, wide enough that the walking becomes almost easy, a rare gift in country like this. You use the ease to look around properly for the first time since entering the gap, the layered rock of the cliff face beside you, striped in shades of gray and rust, telling some story of ancient pressure and time that you can sense without understanding. Small plants grow from cracks in the stone, clinging to whatever soil the wind hasn't stripped away, tiny and tough and somehow thriving in conditions that seem to offer them nothing. Ahead, the shelf narrows again, and you slow your pace accordingly, matching your rhythm to what the ground demands rather than what you'd prefer. This is something the mountain teaches quickly, whether you're ready to learn it or not, that your preferences matter very little here, and the terrain sets the terms. A sound reaches you, distant but unmistakable, a low rumble that isn't thunder, at least not the kind you'd hear from a storm. It comes from somewhere above and to the left, a sustained grinding sound that fades after several seconds into silence. Rockfall, probably somewhere out of sight, a section of the mountain shifting under its own weight the way it does constantly. mostly unnoticed, mostly harmless from a distance. You pause anyway, listening for a moment longer before continuing. The shelf eventually widens into a broader area where the mountainside curves inward, forming something close to a natural alcove. Not quite a cave, but enough of an overhang that you could imagine shelter here if the weather turned. You note it without stopping, the way you've started noting most features of the landscape now, not because you need them immediately, but because knowing where shelter exists is its own kind of preparation. By midday, the sun sits high enough that the wind, while still present, has lost some of its earlier bite. You find a place to rest where the rock face blocks the worst of it, a small hollow just large enough to sit in comfortably. From here you can see far down into the valley on your left, the river a bright thread winding between dark trees, small enough from this height to look almost still, though you know it's moving fast. You eat what little you're carrying, simple food gathered before the climb began, and watch a pair of large birds circle slowly over the valley below, riding some current of warm air rising off the sunstruck slope. They don't flap much either, same as the bird from yesterday. It occurs to you that everything living in this terrain, from the smallest plant to the largest bird, seems to have found some way of working with the mountain rather than against it. You're only beginning to learn that same lesson yourself. The afternoon light shifts the shadows across the valley slowly, each hour revealing a slightly different version of the same landscape. You watch a cloud drift in from the west, small and harmless looking, catching briefly on a distant peak before dissolving. It's the first cloud you've seen all day, and something about it makes you glance toward the sky more carefully than you have been, checking the color, the movement, the shape of things gathering far off. For now, though, nothing suggests urgency. The sky stays mostly clear, the wind stays mostly steady, and the shelf ahead continues its slow curve along the mountainside, promising more of the same careful, deliberate walking that has carried you this far. You finish resting, gather yourself, and continue on, letting the rhythm of the mountain set the pace of the day. The shelf narrows again as the afternoon wears on, forcing your attention back to the immediate ground rather than the wider view. You find yourself falling into the same pattern from earlier eyes down, feet careful, occasional glances up to track the path ahead, and there's something almost restful in the repetition. The way a difficult task becomes manageable once your body learns its rhythm. More clouds have gathered by the time you reach a wider section of trail, no longer the single harmless shape from before, but a loose gathering along the western horizon, pale gray against the blue. They're still distant, still slow-moving, but there are more of them now than there were an hour ago, and the pattern is one you're starting to recognize even without being told what it means. Clouds building around peaks usually means weather is deciding something, somewhere out of sight. You keep walking, but with slightly more attention now, noting the alcove you passed earlier, noting the general shape of the terrain in case the weather does shift and shelter becomes urgent rather than optional. This kind of watching doesn't feel like worry exactly. It feels more like the mountain asking you to pay attention, and you obliging, because ignoring it has never once seemed like the wiser choice. The trail curves around a shoulder of rock and the wind picks up again, funneled by the change in the mountainside's shape. It carries a different smell than before, cooler, damper, something that makes you think of rain even though the sky directly overhead is still clear. You glance west again. The clouds have thickened slightly, their undersides now a darker shade of gray than they were before, and one or two seem to be catching against the higher peaks in a way that suggests they aren't simply passing through. A distant flicker catches your eye, followed a long moment later by a low sound that might be thunder, though it's faint enough that you're not entirely certain. You stop and watch the western sky for a while, weighing what you're seeing against how much daylight remains and how far you are from anything resembling real shelter. The alcove you passed earlier sits maybe 20 minutes back the way you came. Ahead, the trail continues along the shelf for a while longer before curving out of sight around another shoulder of stone, and you have no way of knowing what waits beyond that curve: more shelf, another gap, a place to shelter, or nothing at all. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the decision. You decide against gambling on what's ahead. Mountain weather, you're already learning, doesn't announce itself with much warning, and the alcove behind you is a known thing. A certainty in a landscape that offers very few. You turn back, retracing your steps along the narrow shelf, moving a little faster now than you were before, though not so fast that you abandon the careful footing that's kept you steady all day. The clouds continue building as you walk, and by the time the alcove comes back into view, the wind has shifted entirely, no longer carrying that faint damp coolness, but something sharper, colder, pushing hard enough now that you lean into it slightly with each step. The light has changed too, dimmed by the thickening cloud cover, giving the whole mountainside a flatter, grayer look than it had even an hour ago. You reach the alcove and step into its shelter gratefully, the overhang above cutting the wind almost entirely, leaving you in a pocket of relative calm while the weather outside continues gathering itself into something larger. From here you can see out across the valley, watching the storm's approach without being fully exposed to it, which feels like the best possible arrangement the mountain has offered you all day. The first rain arrives not long after, a scattering of heavy drops striking the exposed rock beyond the overhang, quickly building into a steadier fall. You watch it from your dry pocket of stone, the sound oddly soothing once you're no longer at risk from it, directly a rhythm settling over the mountainside, water finding every crack and channel, beginning the same slow work of shaping the rock that has clearly been happening here for longer than you can imagine. Thunder follows, closer now, rolling across the valley in a way that seems to shake something in your chest even from this distance. You pull yourself a little further back into the alcove, though you're already well protected, some instinct wanting more distance from the sound regardless of how safe you actually are. The rain thickens further, turning the world beyond the overhang into a gray blur, the valley below disappearing entirely into mist and falling water. You wait. There isn't much else to do, and the alcove, modest as it is, does its job well enough. Dry stone above and around you, the storm's full force kept at arm's length. You watch water begin streaming down channels in the rock face that were dry an hour ago, small rivers appearing suddenly where none existed, following paths worn into the stone by countless storms before this one. The wait stretches longer than you expect. Mountain storms, it seems, don't hurry, and this one settles into a steady rhythm of rain and distant thunder that shows no immediate sign of easing. You find a comfortable enough position against the rock, knees drawn up, and let the sound of the storm become something almost restful, now that you're no longer at risk from it. There's a particular kind of calm that comes from being safely dry, while something powerful happens just beyond your shelter, a feeling the mountain seems built to teach, over and over, to anyone who spends enough time in its company. Eventually the rain begins to ease, the heavy drumming softening into something lighter, more scattered, until it fades to an occasional patter and then to nothing at all. The clouds don't clear immediately. They hang low and gray over the valley for a while longer, but the worst of the storm has clearly passed, moving on to whatever peak or valley lies beyond this one. You step out from the alcove cautiously, testing the ground, which has gone slick and dark with rainwater. Small streams now cross parts of the trail that were dry before, and you pick your way around them carefully, aware that wet stone hides its dangers well. The air smells completely different now, washed clean, sharp with the scent of wet rock and rain-struck earth. A smell you'll come to associate with mountain storms the more time you spend here. The light is fading properly now, the storm having stolen what remained of the afternoon, and you decide against pushing further along the shelf tonight. The alcove has proven itself reliable, and reliable is worth more than progress in country like this. You settle back into its shelter as evening deepens, gathering what dry wood you can find nearby, not much, given the rain, but enough for a small fire once you manage to coax one from the driest pieces you can locate. The fire takes longer to catch than it did last night, everything damp from the storm, but eventually a small flame holds, and you feed it carefully, patiently, until it grows steady enough to trust. The alcove traps some of its warmth, reflecting heat back toward you in a way the open basin from last night never did. And you're grateful for the small comfort of it as full dark settles over the mountainside. Below, in the valley, you can see faint moonlight beginning to break through the thinning clouds, silvering the wet rock and the distant river. The storm has passed entirely now, leaving behind a washed, quiet world, and you sit with your small fire in your borrowed shelter of stone, listening to the last drips of water finding their way down the mountainside, the sound gradually slowing until it's little more than an occasional, gentle tick against the rock. The next stretch of your path takes you higher than you've been yet, following a route that climbs steadily away from the shelf and toward a ridge visible against the pale morning sky. The storm has left the air unusually clear, every distant peak sharp, edged, and vivid, snow visible now on slopes that looked merely gray the day before. You climb with the same careful rhythm as always. Though the effort builds differently, here your breath comes shorter, your legs tire faster, and you find yourself pausing more often than the terrain alone would demand. This is altitude doing its own quiet work, you understand, without needing the thought explained to you. The air itself has thinned, offering less with every breath, and your body compensates by working harder for the same result. Research suggests early humans who spent extended time at higher elevations gradually adapted to these conditions, though any single climb like this one would still have demanded real effort and real caution, regardless of experience. The ridge, when you finally reach it, offers a view unlike anything from the days before, peaks in every direction. Some near, some impossibly distant. Their upper slopes streaked white with old snow that never fully melts even in warmer months. The wind here is constant and strong, colder than anything you've felt so far, carrying a bite that has nothing to do with the season and everything to do with simply being this high above everything else. You don't linger long at the top. The wind discourages it, and the thin air makes standing still feel less appealing than it would lower down, where at least stillness comes with the reward of easier breathing. Instead, you follow the ridge itself for a while, a narrow spine of rock with steep drops on either side, requiring the kind of focused attention that leaves little room for anything except the placement of each foot. A silence sits over this high place that you haven't encountered anywhere else on the mountain. Even the wind, loud as it is against your ears, seems to carry less than sound usually does. No birds calling, no distant rockfall, no water running anywhere nearby. Just the wind itself and the vast, indifferent shapes of stone stretching away in every direction. It's the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, in a way that the lower slopes never quite managed. The ridge eventually begins to descend, gently at first, then more steadily, leading you down toward a slope facing away from the wind, where the temperature rises just enough to notice. Patches of old snow cling to shadowed hollows here, refusing to fully surrender even though the exposed rock around them has long since dried in the sun. You walk past one such patch and press your hand briefly into its surface, feeling the cold bite immediately into your palm. A small, direct reminder of how close winter always remains, even in whatever season this actually is. Below the snow line, the terrain softens into something almost gentle, by comparison loose scree giving way to firmer ground, scattered shrubs appearing again after their long absence on the exposed ridge. You follow this gentler slope downward for a long while, the effort of the climb replaced now by the different, equally careful effort of controlled descent. Your knees absorbing each downward step, your weight shifted backward slightly to avoid the momentum that steep ground always threatens to build. A herd of animals appears again below you, larger this time, moving unhurried across a wide stretch of open slope. You watch them graze for a while from a comfortable distance, noting how they seem to know exactly which patches of ground hold the best grass and which hold nothing worth the effort. There's a kind of confidence in the way they move through terrain that still challenges you, a familiarity built from lifetimes spent entirely within these slopes. The descent continues through the afternoon, the ridge and its thin silence now well behind you, replaced by the more familiar textures of forest edge and open grass. You cross another stream, wider than yesterday's, running fast with what must be meltwater from higher slopes, and you take extra care picking your way across the wet stones at its edge, remembering how easily footing fails on ground like this. By the time the light begins its early mountain fade, you've reached a lower shoulder of the range, a place where forest grows thick again and the wind has softened to something almost gentle. You find a spot near a cluster of large stones, similar to the basin from your first night, and begin the familiar process of settling and gathering wood, building a small fire, letting your body finally rest from a day spent almost entirely in motion. The fire catches easily this time, the wood here drier than it was near yesterday's storm-soaked alcove, and you feed it into a steady, comfortable flame. Above you, the peaks you crossed earlier catch the day's last light, glowing faintly gold before surrendering to shadow, and you watch the color drain slowly from stone that, only hours ago, you were standing directly upon. There's a particular satisfaction in watching a place from a distance after having moved through it closely. The ridge that demanded your full attention now reduced to a simple silhouette against the darkening sky, its dangers and difficulties smoothed by distance into something almost peaceful to look at. You understand, sitting here, why the mountain rewards this kind of movement up close, then far, then up close again, each perspective teaching something the other couldn't. You bank the fire a little higher than usual before settling down, mindful of how much colder this shoulder of the mountain feels compared to the sheltered basin from your first night. The stars, when you finally look up properly, seem to multiply the longer you watch them, faint points resolving out of what first looked like empty dark, until the whole sky above the ridge feels crowded and close in a way it never quite does from lower ground. Sleep comes easily that night, your body worn from the climb, the descent, the long day's careful attention to 100 small decisions about footing and wind and shelter. The fire burns low beside you, and somewhere above, the same silence you found on the ridge seems to have followed you partway down, settling over the lower slopes as full dark arrives and the stars begin their slow appearance across a sky swept clear by yesterday's storm. Morning finds you moving again, though at a gentler pace than the days before, following a route that stays mostly level, tracing the contour of the mountainside rather than climbing or descending it directly. This kind of walking has its own rhythm, less demanding than a straight ascent but requiring its own attention, since a contour path often narrows unpredictably or disappears into loose ground that needs careful navigation. The forest here is denser than anywhere you've passed through so far, tall trees closing overhead in places, filtering the morning light into scattered patches on the ground below. It's quieter in a different way than the ridge was not the vast, wind-scoured silence of high altitude, but a closer, more contained quiet, broken occasionally by the call of some unseen bird or the rustle of something moving through undergrowth just out of sight. You follow the path as it winds between the trees, aware of how different the mountain feels here than it did on any of the exposed slopes above. The wind barely reaches you, filtered and softened by the dense growth, and the temperature feels almost mild compared to yesterday's ridge. It occurs to you that a mountain isn't really one place but many, stacked on top of each other, each elevation offering its own conditions, its own dangers, its own small comforts. A fallen tree blocks the path ahead, its trunk thick enough that climbing over it takes real effort, and you take a moment to consider whether going around might be easier. The ground to either side looks uncertain, sloping away toward what might be a drop or might simply be more forest you can't tell from here. You decide on the tree itself, working your way carefully over the trunk, using its broken branches for handholds where they seem solid enough to trust. Beyond the fallen tree, the forest begins to thin again, and you catch glimpses through gaps in the canopy of open ground ahead another slope, another stretch of exposed mountainside waiting beyond the trees. You continue toward it, the path growing clearer as the forest opens, until you step free of the trees entirely and find yourself at the edge of a wide, grassy shoulder of the mountain, the peaks visible again in the distance, closer now than they were from your first night's basin. The wind returns here, gentler than on the high ridge but present enough to notice, moving steadily across the open grass. You pause at the forest's edge for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the wider view after the close, filtered light of the trees. Then continue out into the open, following the shoulder as it curves gradually upward again, promising another climb before the day is finished. The climb this time feels different from the earlier ones, not easier exactly, but more familiar, your body having learned something over the past several days about how to manage this kind of ground. You find the rhythm faster, the pauses shorter, the careful footwork more automatic than it was on that first slope above the basin. This is, you understand without needing the thought spelled out, simply what happens when a person spends enough time somewhere as demanding as this. The mountain doesn't get easier, you get better at it. By midday, you've reached a wide, flat shelf partway up the shoulder, offering a clear view back the way you've come the forest below, the ridge beyond that, and further still, hazy with distance, the basin where this whole journey began. It's a strange feeling, seeing so much of your own path laid out at once. Each difficult stretch reduced to a simple shape on the landscape, its challenges invisible from this distance the same way the ridge's dangers became invisible last evening. You rest here for a while, eating what little remains of your carried food, watching clouds drift lazily across the peaks ahead, none of them carrying the heavy, gathering quality of yesterday's storm clouds. Just simple white shapes moving unhurried against clear blue. The weather, for now, seems content to leave you alone, and you take the small mercy gratefully, knowing from experience now how quickly that could change. The afternoon takes you higher still, the shelf giving way to steeper ground again, scattered with loose stone that demands the same careful attention as always. You've learned enough now to expect this pattern climb. Careful footing, brief rest, climb again, and you settle into it without much conscious thought, your body handling the immediate work while your mind wanders occasionally toward the wider shape of the mountain around you. A narrow ledge appears ahead, running along the base of a steep rock face, offering a way forward that avoids a much longer detour around the shoulder's far side. You approach it carefully, testing the width with a glance before committing. Then move along it with deliberate, measured steps, one hand trailing near the rock wall for reassurance even though you don't actually need to touch it for balance. The ledge leads to a small plateau, more sheltered than the exposed shelf below, where a scattering of large boulders provides some break from the wind. You recognize this kind of place now, the mountain offering these small pockets of relative calm scattered throughout its more difficult terrain. As if it understands that even the most demanding ground needs occasional places to rest. You decide to make camp here for the coming evening, the light already beginning its familiar early fade behind the western peaks. The boulders offer decent shelter, and you set about the now familiar routine, gathering what wood you can find among the sparse growth clinging to this altitude, arranging a small fire pit in the lee of the largest stone, coaxing a flame from kindling that's drier here than it was after yesterday's storm. As the fire catches and steadies, you look out from your plateau across a landscape that has become, over these past days, less foreign than it was when you first stood at the mountain's base. The peaks still tower distant and imposing, still carry weather you can't predict and dangers you're only beginning to understand, but something in how you move through this terrain now feels less like struggle and more like conversation, the mountain setting its terms, and you learning, slowly, how to answer. The fire burns steady through the evening, and you sit close to its warmth as the temperature drops with the fading light, watching the last color leave the surrounding peaks. Somewhere below, in the forest you passed through earlier, an animal calls once, the sound carrying strangely clear in the thin evening air before fading into the wider silence of the mountainside. Sleep finds you gradually that night, your body settling into the hard ground beside the fire with a kind of ease that wouldn't have come naturally on that first evening in the basin. The mountain has taught you, over these days, how to rest within its terms, close to shelter, close to warmth, aware but not anxious, the fire's low light the last thing you notice before the darkness closes fully around your small pocket of calm. Morning on the plateau arrives cold and still, the fire from the night before reduced to a faint warmth beneath gray ash, and you rise slowly, letting your body adjust to the thin air before asking much of it. The peaks around you catch the first light in their usual order, highest points first, the glow sliding gradually down toward your own elevation as the sun clears whatever ridge stands between you and the eastern sky. You break camp at an easy pace, in no particular hurry this morning, and set off along a route that traces the base of a steep rock face rising sharply to your right. The stone here looks different from anything you've crossed so far, darker, more fractured, scattered with loose fragments that suggest this section of mountain sheds itself more readily than the solid gray stone further back along your path. A sound reaches you almost immediately. A sharp crack followed by a short, tumbling rattle somewhere above and ahead. You stop at once, eyes tracking upward along the fractured face, and catch the tail end of a small rockfall a scatter of fist-sized stones bouncing down a shallow gully before settling into stillness. Nothing large, nothing close, but enough to remind you why this stretch of ground deserves more attention than the gentler slopes behind you. You wait a moment longer before continuing, listening for any further movement. Then proceed with your eyes divided now between the ground at your feet and the rock face above. A habit you didn't have on your first day, but have built steadily since. The mountain teaching you through repetition exactly which sounds deserve a pause and which can be safely ignored. Early humans crossing loose or fractured terrain like this would likely have relied on exactly this kind of divided attention, watching both the ground and the slope above for any sign of movement. The path narrows as it follows the base of the rock face, forcing you closer to the fractured stone than feels entirely comfortable, though the alternative, a long detour around the shoulder, would cost far more time than the mild discomfort is worth. You move quickly through the narrowest stretch, not rushing exactly, but not lingering either, aware that speed matters more here than it has on most of the terrain you've crossed. Beyond the fractured section, the rock face eases back into more solid ground, and you slow again, letting your shoulders drop from the tension you hadn't fully noticed building. A short scramble over a jumble of larger boulders brings you to a narrow gap between two higher shoulders of stone, similar to the saddle from your very first day, though tighter, requiring you to turn slightly sideways in places to fit through comfortably. Wind funnels hard through the gap, as it always seems to in these narrow places, carrying a cold edge that cuts through the morning's earlier stillness. You move through quickly, emerging on the far side into a wide bowl of ground scattered with more of the same fractured, dark stone, though here it lies settled and stable, long since finished with whatever shifting brought it down from the slopes above. You cross the bowl at a steady pace, listening out of habit now for any further sound of falling stone, though the ground here feels calmer, more settled, than the narrow stretch behind you. A thin stream cuts across the bowl's floor, running clear over the dark stone, and you follow its edge for a while, since water, as always, tends to have already found the easiest route through difficult ground. The stream leads you toward a gentler slope on the bowl's far side, and you climb it steadily, the effort familiar now, your breathing settling into the same measured rhythm you've relied on across every ascent of this journey. By the time you reach the top of the rise, the narrow gap and its loose, fractured stone are well behind you, reduced already to just another difficult stretch successfully crossed, filed away alongside the river crossing and the high ridge and the long climb from that very first basin. From this new vantage, the land ahead opens into the deep valley you glimpsed yesterday from the narrow shelf, the one that will eventually lead you to the river below. You pause here briefly, getting your bearings, watching a thin plume of mist rise from somewhere deep in the valley's forested floor, evidence of the river's presence even before you can hear it. Then you continue on, beginning the same steady, careful descent that has carried you safely down every difficult slope so far. The descent takes you in a different direction than the climbing and descending of the days before, down and sideways, following the fold of the valley toward the deep forest below, angling steadily closer to the river you glimpsed from the rise. The thin thread of water grows steadily more real as you descend toward it, its sound reaching you first. A low, steady rush carried up through the trees long before you can see the water itself. The slope here is steeper than most of what you've crossed so far, forcing a different kind of movement, shorter steps, weight held back, hands occasionally finding a low branch or a solid outcrop of stone to steady yourself against the pull of gravity. You've grown used to climbing by now, the effort of pushing upward against the mountain, but descending steep ground asks something different of your legs, a controlled resistance that tires you in ways the climbing didn't. The forest thickens as you drop lower, the trees taller and closer together than anywhere you've passed through before, their canopy dense enough to dim the light to something almost dusk, like even though the day is still young. Roots cross the path in tangled knots, forcing your attention downward again, each step considered before it's taken. The sound of the river grows louder the further you descend, until it becomes a constant presence beneath the quieter forest sounds, birds calling somewhere above, the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of something unseen. You reach the river's edge by mid-morning, and the sight of it up close is different from the thin silver thread of yesterday's high view, wide and fast, churning white where it breaks over submerged stone, deep green-gray where it slows into calmer stretches. The far bank rises steeply into another shoulder of the mountain, thick with trees, and somewhere beyond that, out of sight, the terrain will presumably climb again toward another set of peaks. Crossing here doesn't look possible, not directly, not with the water moving this fast and this deep. You follow the bank instead, walking upstream, watching the river's character change as you go narrower in some places, wider in others, the current sometimes calm enough to seem crossable before a glance further along reveals rapids that would make any attempt foolish. Early humans navigating mountain river valleys would have learned to read water this way, watching for the places where a river's force gathered and where it eased, long before attempting to cross. A fallen tree spans part of the river ahead, its trunk thick and mostly intact, bridging perhaps 2/3 of the distance to the far bank before the remaining branches disappear into the current. You approach it carefully, testing the trunk's stability with your weight before committing to it fully. It holds. You move across slowly, one careful step after another. The roar of the water directly beneath you now, loud enough that it seems to fill your whole body rather than just your ears. The trunk ends short of the far bank, leaving a gap of several feet where you'll need to commit to a jump across shallower, faster water onto a shelf of exposed stone. You judge the distance carefully, watching the water's movement for a moment to find its rhythm. Then commit a short, decisive leap that lands you hard but steady on the far stone, one foot slipping slightly before catching. Your heart beats harder than the effort alone would explain, the particular alertness that comes from having trusted your body with something that could easily have gone wrong. You climb up from the river's edge onto firmer ground, glancing back once at the water still churning below, already looking less threatening now that you've successfully crossed it. The way any obstacle does once it's behind you rather than ahead. The far bank rises steeply, and you begin climbing again almost immediately, the brief rest at the river giving way to another stretch of steady, demanding effort. The trees here grow differently than on the near bank, older somehow, their trunks thicker and their canopy higher, letting more light reach the forest floor in scattered patches. You follow a route that seems to have been used before, not a clear path exactly, but a subtle wearing of the ground, a slight flattening of undergrowth that suggests other feet, human or otherwise, have passed this way with some regularity. You follow it without quite deciding to, trusting that whatever made this faint trail probably knew the terrain better than you do. The trail leads you along the base of a cliff face that rises sharply on your right gray stone streaked with darker mineral lines, water seeping from cracks high above and running down in thin, glistening trails before disappearing into moss at the base. The path narrows here, forced between the cliff and a steep drop on the left, where the ground falls away toward the river you crossed earlier, now visible again far below, reduced once more to something that looks smaller and calmer from this height than it felt up close. You move along the narrow stretch with the same careful attention you've given every difficult passage on this journey, one hand occasionally brushing the cool, damp stone of the cliff face for reassurance. The drop to your left isn't sheer, exactly, but steep enough that a misstep would mean a hard, unpleasant tumble rather than anything worse, and that possibility alone is enough to keep your focus fully on the ground directly ahead. The path widens again after a stretch, the cliff face softening into a more gradual slope, and you find yourself in a small clearing where the trees give way briefly to open sky. A pair of large birds wheel overhead, riding some current rising off the sun-warmed cliff, and you watch them for a moment before continuing, the clearing offering a brief, welcome pause from the narrow concentration the cliffside path demanded. Beyond the clearing, the ground begins to climb again, more gently this time, following the natural contour of the valley wall as it curves toward a higher shoulder of the mountain. The river's sound fades gradually behind you, replaced by the quieter rustle of wind moving through the canopy overhead, and you settle into the steady rhythm of climbing once more, your legs finding the same careful, deliberate pace they've learned across the past several days. By early afternoon, you've climbed high enough that the trees begin thinning again, the dense valley forest giving way to the scattered, wind-bent growth you've come to associate with higher elevation. The air cools noticeably as you climb, and you can feel the change in your own breathing. Shorter and more effortful than it was down by the river, the mountain once again quietly extracting its price for every bit of height gained. A wide, gently sloped basin opens ahead as the trees finally clear entirely, ringed on three sides by higher ridges, its floor scattered with loose stone and patches of tough grass. It reminds you slightly of the first basin from your earliest evening on the mountain, though the shape of the surrounding peaks is different, unfamiliar, confirming just how far you've traveled since that first uncertain night. You cross the basin at an easy pace, grateful for the relatively flat ground after the morning's demanding descent and climb. Small streams thread across the basin floor, fed by patches of old snow clinging to the shadowed folds of the surrounding ridges, and you cross each one without much difficulty, the water shallow and slow here compared to the river far below. Partway across the basin, you notice a scattering of bones near a cluster of stones old, weathered, clearly the remains of some animal that didn't survive whatever this place demanded of it. You pause briefly to look, without quite knowing what to make of it, before continuing on. The mountain offers shelter and beauty in equal measure to danger and difficulty, and this small scene feels like a quiet, unspoken reminder of that fact. One you file away alongside everything else you've learned these past days. The far side of the basin rises toward a low pass between two peaks, and you make for it steadily, the effort building again as the ground steepens. Clouds have begun gathering along the western horizon once more, pale and distant for now, but enough to draw your attention, given what you've already learned about how quickly such things can change. You keep half an eye on them as you climb, weighing the distance still ahead against the uncertain pace of whatever weather might be building. The pass itself, when you reach it, offers a narrow view through to yet another valley beyond, this one wider and greener than the one you crossed this morning. A river visible again far below, though calmer looking than the one with the fallen tree crossing. Wind funnels hard through the gap, cold and insistent, and you don't linger, moving through quickly and beginning the descent on the far side almost immediately. This new slope is gentler than much of what you've crossed today, and you make good progress down it, the wind easing as you drop below the pass's exposed line. By the time you reach the tree line again, the clouds from earlier have thickened somewhat, but still show no immediate sign of turning into anything as serious as the storm from days before. You decide to press on a while longer, making the most of the remaining daylight before the mountain's early shadow catches up with you. The forest on this side of the pass feels different again, younger trees, more light reaching the ground, a scattering of low shrubs bearing small, dark berries that you recognize from your journey's earlier days as safe to eat. You gather a handful as you pass, a small, welcome supplement to the food you're still carrying, and continue on with the easy satisfaction of a day that has, despite its challenges, gone mostly as well as you could have hoped. As the afternoon light begins its familiar lean toward evening, you find a suitable place to stop for the night, a shallow hollow at the base of a rocky outcrop, offering decent shelter from the wind without requiring the full protection of a cave. You set about the now practiced routine of making camp, gathering wood, building a small fire, watching the light fade slowly from the peaks visible above the tree line. Sitting by the fire this evening, you find yourself thinking back over the river crossing from earlier in the day. The particular alertness of that jump across the gap in the fallen tree. The moment of uncertainty before your foot found solid stone. It's the kind of memory that mountains seem to generate constantly small moments of real consequence, quickly passed through, quickly left behind, but somehow lingering longer in memory than the easier stretches of walking that surrounded them. The fire holds steady through the evening, and above the tree line, the peaks catch the day's last light one more time before surrendering to shadow. The same slow, familiar process you've watched unfold every evening of this journey. You feed the fire a little more wood, settle back against the rock at your side, and let the day's effort finally ease out of your body. The sound of some distant stream the only thing breaking the quiet as full dark settles over the valley below. The morning after the river crossing brings clear skies again, the clouds from yesterday's pass having drifted off overnight, leaving the peaks sharp against pale early light. You break camp without hurry, the fire smothered carefully, the hollow at the rock's base left the way you found it, and continue along the shoulder of the mountain, following a route that climbs gradually higher through scattered trees before opening once more onto exposed ground. The terrain here feels familiar in a way that surprises you slightly. Another wide slope, another scattering of loose stone, another wind pressing steady against your chest as you climb. You've crossed enough of this kind of ground now that your body barely needs instruction anymore, feet finding their placement almost without your attention, leaving your mind freer than it's been most mornings to simply notice the mountain around you rather than manage your passage through it. A distant sound reaches you partway up the slope, not thunder, not rockfall, something else. A low, resonant call that repeats twice before falling silent. You stop and listen, scanning the higher ground for movement, but see nothing. The sound doesn't repeat again, and you're left uncertain what made it. Some animal communicating across the distance in a way particular to creatures who live somewhere this exposed, where sound carries further and sight matters less than it does in denser country. You continue climbing, the sound staying with you a while longer than it probably should, some part of your attention still tuned toward the direction it came from. This, too, feels like something the mountain has taught you, a heightened awareness of things heard but not seen, understood by their sound alone, filed away as information even without a clear source to attach it to. By mid-morning you reach a long, high shoulder of rock that offers a view back across much of the ground you've already crossed, the river valley below, the pass you came through yesterday, and further still, hazy with distance, the plateau where you camped 2 nights ago. Seeing it all at once gives you a strange sense of scale. The accumulated effort of several days reduced to a single sweep of the eye. Each difficult stretch of terrain now just another fold in a landscape that stretches, apparently, in every direction you look. The wind is stronger here than it's been most of the morning, funneled along the shoulder in a steady, insistent push that makes you lean slightly into it as you walk. You notice the grass here grows almost flat against the ground, permanently bent by wind that never really stops, and the few shrubs that manage to survive have taken on a low, hunched shape, hugging close to whatever shelter the terrain offers them. Ahead, the shoulder narrows into something closer to a true ridge, exposed on both sides, the ground falling away steeply to valleys on either hand. You slow your pace here, the same careful, deliberate walking you used on the high ridge from days before. one foot placed with full attention before the other follows. The silence returns too, that particular high-altitude quiet that swallows most sound except the wind itself, and you find yourself holding your breath slightly at the more exposed sections, though there's no real reason to. A small herd of mountain animals appears on a slope below, working their way along a route that looks, from this height, almost too narrow to hold their weight. You watch them for a while, the same quiet fascination you felt each time you've encountered these creatures on this journey, moving through terrain that would demand your full concentration with an ease that looks, from a distance, almost careless. It isn't carelessness, you understand. It's simply a familiarity built from a lifetime spent entirely within ground like this. The same familiarity you're only beginning to build for yourself. The ridge eventually widens again, the exposed rock giving way to a broader, gentler slope where walking becomes easier and your attention can drift a little further from the immediate ground. You use the ease to look more carefully at the sky, checking for any sign of the kind of weather that caught you off guard the first time. For now, the sky stays clear, pale blue stretching uninterrupted above the peaks, and you allow yourself to relax slightly, though not so much that you stop checking altogether. By early afternoon, the ridge curves downward toward a wide, sheltered basin, different from the others you've crossed but recognizable in its general shape, a bowl of ground ringed by higher peaks, offering protection from wind on most sides, scattered with large weathered stones and patches of tough grass. You descend into it gratefully, the wind easing noticeably as the surrounding rock begins to block it, replaced by a stillness that feels almost startling after the exposed ridge above. This basin feels different from the earlier one somehow. Quieter even by the standards of quiet mountain places, and you take a moment once you've settled near a cluster of stones to simply notice that quiet, the absence of wind, the absence of any obvious sound beyond your own breathing and the occasional, faint trickle of water somewhere nearby. It's the kind of silence that makes you aware of small things, a beetle moving across a nearby stone, the faint smell of crushed grass beneath your feet, the particular texture of sunlight falling unfiltered onto bare rock. You decide to rest here for a while longer than usual, in no particular hurry given the ease of yesterday's and this morning's travel, and use the time to check your carried supplies, mend a torn piece of hide wrapped around your foot, and simply sit with the stillness the basin offers. Early humans moving through mountain terrain likely relied on these sheltered basins not only for physical protection, but as places to rest more fully than exposed ground allowed, gathering strength before continuing into whatever difficulty lay ahead. A soft shift in the wind eventually reaches even this protected hollow, a faint current curling down from one of the surrounding ridges, carrying with it a change in temperature you notice immediately after the day's stillness. You glance up. The sky beyond the basin's rim still looks clear, but the wind's sudden appearance here in a place that's been so still all afternoon feels worth paying attention to. You decide to use the remaining daylight to move a little further before making camp, wanting to put a bit more ground behind you while the weather still seems to be holding. The far side of the basin rises gently toward a gap between two lower peaks, less dramatic than yesterday's pass but still requiring a real climb. And you set off toward it with the ease of a body that has, by now, grown fully accustomed to this kind of steady, sustained effort. The climb takes the better part of an hour, the ground shifting gradually from the basin's grass and scattered stone to a steeper slope of looser scree that demands your full attention again. You place each foot carefully, testing the ground before committing, the same rhythm you've practiced across nearly every slope of this journey. Small stones occasionally slip loose beneath your feet, clattering down the incline behind you, a sound you've grown used enough to that it barely registers as anything worth pausing for. Near the top of the gap, the wind picks up sharply again, colder now than it was in the sheltered basin below, carrying that same faint mineral smell you noticed on your very first climb toward a saddle, days ago now, though it feels both longer and shorter ago than that depending on how you measure it. You push through the gap quickly, the wind pressing hard against you for the brief stretch of exposed ground, and emerge on the far side into another wide view, more peaks, more valleys, the landscape continuing to unfold in every direction with no obvious end. The descent on this side is gentle, easing you down toward a stretch of open, grassy slope dotted with the same low shrubs and scattered stone you've grown familiar with. The light has begun its familiar lean toward evening by the time you reach more level ground, the sun dropping toward peaks now behind you rather than ahead, casting long shadows across the grass that stretch further with each passing minute. You find a place to camp near the edge of a stand of low, wind-bent trees, offering just enough shelter to make the evening comfortable without requiring a full search for cave or overhang. The routine by now feels almost effortless, gathering wood, clearing a small space for the fire, arranging what few belongings you carry within easy reach. You work through it without much conscious thought, your hands remembering the sequence even when your mind wanders elsewhere. The fire catches quickly this evening, the wood dry and the wind gentle enough not to fight you for it, and you settle back to watch the last light drain from the peaks around you, the sky shifting slowly from pale blue to a deep, darkening gold along the western ridgeline. Somewhere in the distance, that same low, resonant call from this morning repeats once, fainter now, further off. And you listen to it fade without concern, simply another sound belonging to a landscape you've come to feel less foreign within than you did on that very first evening. You eat what remains of the berries gathered yesterday, along with the last of your carried food, and consider without much worry that tomorrow will likely require finding more before the day is through. The mountain has provided enough so far: water from countless streams, shelter from stone and overhang, food from the low shrubs scattered across its slopes, and you've learned to trust, cautiously, that it will likely continue to, provided you keep paying the kind of attention it demands. The stars emerge gradually as full dark settles over the slope, sharp and plentiful the way they've been on every clear night of this journey, and you lie back near the fire's fading warmth, feeling the accumulated effort of the day settle into a tired, satisfied stillness through your legs and shoulders. Tomorrow will bring more climbing, more careful footing, more of the mountain's steady demands, but for tonight at least, the ground beneath you feels solid. The fire beside you holds its small warmth, and the wide, quiet dark above feels less like uncertainty and more like simple company. You wake before full light the next morning to a change in the air. Something you notice before you fully understand it, the same way you notice the mountain's presence on that very first day at its base. The wind carries a different weight now, colder and heavier, and looking up from your sheltered plateau, you see clouds gathered thick and low around the peaks above, a gray mass that wasn't there when you fell asleep. You break camp quickly, without the leisurely pace of previous mornings, some instinct urging efficiency now that the weather has shifted so noticeably overnight. The fire is smothered and cold within minutes, your few belongings gathered, and you move out from the shelter of the boulders to assess the wider sky, trying to read what this particular gathering of cloud might mean for the day ahead. The clouds seem to be settling rather than passing, thickening around the higher peaks in a way that suggests snow rather than rain, given how the temperature has dropped overnight. You touch the exposed rock near your feet and find it cold enough to sting slightly, colder than it's been on any previous morning of this journey. Something about today feels different, and you decide against pushing further upward, choosing instead to work your way along a lower, more sheltered route that skirts beneath the worst of the gathering weather. The path you choose follows a natural fold in the mountainside, a shallow valley that offers some protection from the wind now beginning to gust unpredictably from the peaks above. You move quickly but carefully, aware that speed and caution don't always sit comfortably together on ground like this, but also aware that lingering too long in exposed terrain, with weather building overhead, carries its own clear risk. The first snow arrives not long after, fine and scattered at first, barely more than a few flakes carried sideways on the wind, easy to mistake for nothing at all. But it thickens quickly, the way mountain weather seems to specialize in doing, until within a short while the air is genuinely full of it, softening the shapes of the rocks around you. Muffling sound in that particular way snow always does. You keep to the sheltered fold, grateful now for the choice you made earlier, watching the snow accumulate on exposed surfaces around you while your own path remains relatively clear, protected by the terrain's natural shape. Visibility shortens considerably, the peaks above disappearing entirely into the gray-white confusion of falling snow and low cloud, and you find yourself navigating more by the immediate shape of the ground than by any wider view of where you're headed. A shape emerges from the snow ahead, not a threat, just an animal moving through the same difficult weather, its outline softened by the falling snow until it's little more than a dark smudge against the white. It doesn't seem to notice you, or doesn't care, continuing along its own path through the storm with the same unhurried confidence you've seen in every mountain creature since your journey began. You let it pass, keeping your own distance, and continue along the fold. The snowfall doesn't ease as the morning wears on, if anything thickening further, and you begin actively searching now for something more substantial than the shallow fold's modest protection. The ground rises slightly to your right, suggesting rock rather than open slope, and you follow that rise, hoping it might offer the kind of overhang or hollow that sheltered you before on this journey. You find it eventually not the alcove from before, but something similar, a shallow cave mouth set into the base of a rock face, deep enough to offer real shelter from the snow, if not quite deep enough to disappear into fully. You duck inside gratefully, brushing snow from your shoulders, and turn to watch the storm continue outside. The world beyond the cave mouth reduced now to a swirling wall of white. The cave holds a different kind of quiet than the alcove did during the rain. Snow muffles sound more thoroughly than rain ever does, and the world outside seems to fade into something almost soft, distant, cushioned. You settle into the driest corner you can find, drawing your knees up against the cold, and wait. Understanding by now that waiting is simply part of what mountain travel demands, as essential to the journey as the walking itself. Time passes strangely inside the shelter, the storm outside showing no clear signs of easing. The light staying flat and gray throughout what you assume is midday, though it's difficult to tell precisely with the sun so thoroughly hidden. You find what little dry wood you can inside the cave's mouth, remnants perhaps of some previous traveler's shelter, and manage eventually to coax together a small fire, more for the psychological comfort of its light than for any real warmth it offers against the deeper cold outside. The snow continues into the afternoon, and you begin to understand that this storm might hold you here for longer than you'd hoped. This doesn't trouble you as much as it might have on your first day among these peaks. You've learned enough now about mountain weather to expect exactly this kind of interruption. And the cave, modest as it is, offers everything you actually need: shelter, a small fire, and the patience to wait out something larger than yourself. By the time the light begins its early fade toward evening, the snowfall has finally started to ease, thinning from a thick, blinding fall to something lighter, more scattered, individual flakes visible now against the darkening sky rather than the solid white curtain of before. You watch from the cave mouth as the world outside slowly reappears, the fold you followed here, dusted white now. The rocks beyond softened under a fresh layer of snow that wasn't there this morning. You decide against moving further tonight, the light already too far gone and the ground outside too uncertain under its new covering. The cave offers everything you need for one more evening, and you settle back into its shelter, feeding your small fire, listening to the last of the snow tapering off outside until the mountainside falls into the particular deep silence that follows a storm, a stillness so complete it feels almost solid, wrapping around the cave mouth and holding the whole slope in quiet suspension. The following morning arrives clear and sharp, the storm having passed entirely overnight, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow covers everything within sight, blanketing the rocks and the sparse mountain grass in a layer that catches the early light and throws it back in a brightness that makes you squint even from inside the cave's shelter. The air feels different again, colder but somehow cleaner, scoured by the storm into something crisp and thin. You step out from the cave cautiously, testing the snow's depth with each footfall, finding it manageable here in the sheltered fold but likely deeper on the more exposed slopes above. The mountain has changed overnight in ways both beautiful and practically significant. Familiar paths now hidden beneath white, familiar landmarks softened into unfamiliar shapes, requiring you to navigate with more care than you needed even a few days ago. The descent begins gradually, following the same fold that sheltered you through yesterday's storm, now tracing a path downward rather than along the contour. Snow gives way to slush and then to bare wet ground as you drop in elevation, the temperature climbing steadily with each step lower, until within an hour the world around you looks entirely different from the winter scene you left behind at the cave. Meltwater runs everywhere on this lower ground, small channels appearing where the snow above is giving itself up to the returning warmth, feeding streams that weren't nearly this full when you passed this way climbing upward. You cross one such stream carefully, the water higher and faster than it was days ago, requiring you to search out a wider, shallower crossing point rather than the direct route you might have taken before. The forest reappears as you continue downward, its canopy heavy with clinging snow that occasionally releases itself in small, soft collapses, dropping clumps onto the ground below with a muffled sound that startles you slightly each time it happens nearby. You move through the trees carefully, aware that the snow-laden branches overhead carry their own small hazard, however minor, and glad each time you pass beneath one without incident. By midday, you've dropped low enough that the snow has mostly disappeared from the ground itself, though it remains visible on the peaks behind you, a stark white line marking the elevation where winter still holds firm against the returning warmth below. You pause to look back at the mountains you've been moving through these past days, their upper slopes now genuinely white, their lower slopes green and gray as they were when you first arrived. You stop for a while at a wide, sun-warmed rock beside the trail, glad simply to sit without the immediate demand of careful footing for a few minutes. Meltwater still runs everywhere around you, threading between stones in small, busy channels, each one finding its own particular path downhill, some merging with others, some disappearing beneath rock only to reappear again further along. You watch one such channel for a while, tracing its route with your eyes, noticing how it always finds the lowest available ground, never fighting the shape of the land, simply following whatever the mountain offers it. A pair of birds settle briefly on a nearby branch, calling once to each other before continuing on, and you notice how ordinary their presence feels now compared to how carefully you noticed every detail of this landscape on your first days here. The mountain hasn't become less demanding, exactly, but your attention has settled into something steadier, less startled by each new sound or shift in the ground, more capable of simply moving through it the way the birds do, the way the grazing animals do, without treating every moment as a fresh negotiation with unfamiliar terrain. You gather yourself again after a while and continue down the trail, the sun higher now. Warm enough on the exposed sections that you're glad for the shade whenever the path dips back beneath the trees. The transition from the mountain's higher, harder ground to this gentler, greener country happens gradually, without any single obvious boundary, the same way the climb into the mountains happened days ago, not a line crossed, but a slow accumulation of small changes, noticed only in looking back. The path continues through familiar feeling terrain now, forest edge and open grass alternating the way they did on that very first day, though you notice yourself reading the ground differently now than you did then. Small details catch your attention that would have gone unnoticed a week ago, the lean of the trees, the pattern of loose stone, the particular quality of wind that suggests one kind of weather or another. The mountain has taught you this patiently across every difficult stretch of ground you've crossed. A patch of fog settles into the lower part of the valley as you continue, thick enough in places to soften the shapes of trees only a short distance away into pale, uncertain outlines. You slow your pace instinctively, the way the mountain has taught you to whenever visibility shortens, keeping close to the more obvious contours of the ground rather than risking a shortcut you can't fully see. The fog doesn't feel threatening exactly, just close, muffling sound the same way the earlier snow did, wrapping the forest in a hush that makes your own footsteps seem unusually loud. You pass beneath a low outcrop of stone, water dripping steadily from some unseen crack above, each drop landing with a small, sharp sound against a flat rock below, oddly distinct against the fog's general quiet. It's the kind of detail you might have walked past without noticing days ago, before the mountain taught you to notice almost everything: the drip, the particular gray of the fog, the way the ground here holds slightly more moisture than the drier slopes higher up. The fog thins gradually as the path descends further, the sun's warmth finally strong enough at this lower elevation to burn through what the higher, cooler ground couldn't manage. By the time you reach a shallow crossing where a narrow stream cuts through the trail, the mist has cleared almost entirely, leaving the forest sharp and bright around you, sunlight scattering in broken patches across the damp ground. You cross the stream without difficulty, the water barely reaching your ankles here, nothing like the fierce crossing from days before, and continue along a stretch of trail that hugs the base of a modest cliff, low enough that it barely qualifies as one, though the drop to your left still deserves the same careful attention you'd give any exposed edge. A narrow shelf of stone carries you past it, no wider than the ones you crossed higher up, and you move through it with the same unhurried, practiced care, no longer needing to remind yourself to look down before each step. Beyond the shelf, the trail opens into a wider stretch of forest, the trees older and further apart, allowing more light to reach the ground in wide, warm patches. You pause in one such patch, letting the sun settle briefly against your shoulders, a small, simple pleasure that feels earned after the accumulated effort of the days behind you. A bird calls somewhere close by, answered a moment later by another further off, the exchange passing back and forth a few times before falling quiet again. The ground continues its gradual decline, the mountain's steepness easing bit by bit with every stretch of trail, until the effort of walking begins to feel less like climbing or descending and more like simple movement across gently rolling ground. You notice the change in your own body to the particular tiredness of altitude beginning to lift, replaced by the more ordinary fatigue of a long day's walking, familiar and manageable in a way the earlier exhaustion wasn't. A wider clearing opens ahead, marked by a scattering of large, flat stones half sunk into the grass, worn smooth by some combination of water and time you can't begin to guess at. You cross it slowly, in no particular hurry now that the terrain has eased so considerably, letting your eyes travel back up toward the peaks behind you, visible now as a distant, layered silhouette rather than the immediate demanding presence they were only days ago. Somewhere behind those peaks, the snow is likely still falling in patches, the wind still pressing hard against exposed ridges, the silence still holding over high, thin air the way it held around you when you crossed it. It's strange to think of all that continuing, unseen and indifferent, while you walk here in warm, gentle light, the mountain's more difficult moods left behind for now, though not forgotten. You reach a wide, grassy slope by mid-afternoon, close enough now to your original point of arrival that the landscape has started to feel less like unknown territory and more like a place you're beginning, genuinely, to know. A small herd grazes in the distance, unhurried as always, and you watch them for a while before continuing, feeling something settle in your chest that has less to do with tiredness and more to do with a kind of quiet satisfaction at having moved through so much difficult, demanding ground and come out the other side of it still steady. The light begins its familiar early fade as you approach the lower foothills, the peaks behind you catching the day's last color while the ground around you slides gradually into shadow. You find a spot near the forest edge, similar to your very first camp, and begin the now deeply familiar routine of settling in for the evening gathering wood, building a small fire, letting the day's walking finally ease out of your legs. Sitting by the fire this final evening, you look back up toward the peaks one more time, their snow-covered upper slopes glowing faintly in the last light before the shadow claims them fully. It's a strange thing, you think, without quite forming the thought into words, how a place so demanding, so willing to show its danger at every turn, can also feel by the end of it something close to generous, offering shelter when you needed it, paths when you needed them, and a kind of hard-won calm that seems to settle deeper the longer you spend within its reach. The fire burns low as full evening arrives, and you feed it just enough to hold through the coming hours, no longer building it as high as you did on that very first uncertain night. You've learned exactly how much warmth you need, exactly how much wood the evening requires, and the small fire settles into a steady, quiet glow beside you. Above, the stars begin their slow appearance, sharp and close the way they've been every clear night on this journey, and you lie back against the grass, feeling the last of the mountain's cold settle around your shoulders while the fire holds its small circle of warmth close. Somewhere above, the peaks you've crossed and camped beneath and sheltered within stand quiet against the night sky, indifferent as always to your presence, exactly as they were on that first evening at the mountain's base. Somewhere further up the slope, a small sound drifts down a single loose stone, shifting, settling into some new resting place after who knows how long balanced where it was. You don't lift your head to check. There's no need. It's just the mountain doing what it always does, quietly rearranging some small piece of itself, indifferent to whether anyone happens to be listening. You are, tonight, tomorrow, perhaps, you won't be. Either way, the mountain will go on. You close your eyes to the sound of the fire settling, the distant, almost imperceptible movement of wind through the tree line nearby, and the deep, wide silence of the mountains beyond, a silence you understand now not as emptiness, but as the sound of something enormous holding still, letting you rest within its reach for one more quiet night before the journey. Whatever comes next of it continues. The fire burns down slowly through the hours, coals glowing softer and softer until only a faint red remains beneath the ash, and the mountainside around you settles fully into night, the ridges dark against a sky full of stars, the valleys below wrapped in a deeper darkness still, and the whole enormous shape of the range holding its quiet the way it has held it long before you arrived, and will go on holding it long after you've gone, patient and still and utterly unbothered by the passing of one more traveler through its ancient, demanding ground. Far off, somewhere near the high ridge you crossed days ago, the wind is likely still moving the way it always does up there, steady and cold against bare rock, indifferent to the hour. Down here, in the shelter of the lower slope, none of that reaches you anymore. Only the fire's last warmth, and the grass beneath you, and the slow, settling weight of sleep finally closing over the whole long, quiet day.